Hello, everyone. Love and blessings. Welcome to yet another episode of Dragonfly Heart Medicine Radio. I have the pleasure of speaking to some really awesome guests over the past few months, and this guest is no exception. So with me today, I have Bob Cohen, and if you just want to tell us a little bit about yourself and what has brought you here today to be on the podcast.
Well, sure. So, of course, you and I met last year at an event that was connected to Thank You Plant Medicine. I do an unscripted an unscripted live stream, and so I was partnering with Thank You Plant Medicine to do an event with a group of people in Sweden called World of Wisdom. Jonathan, who is one of the co-founders of Thank You Plant Medicine, put out the word, and Kristen was one of the people that we trapped in our net. And she shared a story. Kristen shared a story at that event, and then subsequently, Kristen appeared on Ouroboros Story Hour, which is my project. And we stayed in touch. So I am, how do we do this? I hate defining myself in these ways, but you know, for the normies out there, of which I do a good job of pretending, but for the normies out there, by day I'm an English professor. I teach writing and literature classes. I produce and host Ouroboros Story Hour, which is a project devoted to exploring the relationship between transpersonal experiences and story, and how do we understand those experiences, how do we bring them into our lives, and how do we reach out to the whole wide world in an effort to do the best we can to make the world make the world a better place. I'm also a writer. And so I'm a published poet, and I spent a long time as a freelance journalist. I'm currently working on putting together a couple of books of poetry, a creative nonfiction piece, and I have a novel that I'm pulling up out of mothballs that I want to try to get out in the next 6 or 7 months. I'm a dad. I've been married for, next week it'll be 38 years.
Wow.
And so that's me.
Yeah, thank you for sharing. And we have a lot in common. We know we're both teachers. We enjoy writing and telling stories. And yes, that's interesting. And actually, Jonathan from Thank You Plant Medicine is going to be a guest on later in the year. So that'll be fun.
Oh, nice. Nice.
Yeah. So tell us more about your story hour, what it kind of looks like, and like kind of the importance of telling stories when we're in the process of integrating from, life events or plant medicine work.
Sure. So I'm going to provide sort of like a slightly a context for story hour. So in my life, I worked really hard to pretend to be a normal person for a long time. And there came a point probably about 10 years ago when we had my family, my wife and I and my family had a big corrective incident that gave us a good 8-9 years of really struggling to sort of like bring pieces together, to sort things out, to go forward in a way that was more aligned with who we were as people. So part of that process was that we ended up struggling financially for a good number of years. And so I, fell into a really super deep depression. I actually became suicidal. There was a point where I was in my garage with a rope around my neck, and the only reason I didn't kick it out from under me was because I didn't want my kids to come home and find me like that from school, from their school day. And so around that time, there were like 2 or 3 articles. This was like summer of 2013. So around that time, there were 2 or 3 articles it was like Washington Post, New Yorker, and something else about psilocybin research. So this is sort of like at the, just as the psychedelic renaissance was just starting to crest. The way was just starting to crest. So I looked at it and I go, yeah, I did mushrooms when I was in college a couple of times. So that was really fun. And I connected to it. And it's funny how like sometimes you know that something's going to be in your future and it's going to be a big part of your life, but I get this like kind of like feeling inside myself, and I often don't pay attention to it. So I was like, all right, you know. But when retrospectively, I know I had a moment where I was like, this is going to be like my life, right? So things are still not getting better. I did a bunch of research. I found a conference on psychedelic research in New York called Horizons, Perspectives on Psychedelics. And I got myself there and began the process of getting connected to the research and to the psychedelic world, I guess, is how I would have framed it at that time. So in that process, so like one of the jokes that I always tell people is that, you know, when you're young, you know drug dealers, you get a little older, you know people who know drug dealers, you get to be middle-aged, and if you ask for drugs, people assume you're a cop, a narc, right? Because they're like, well, especially somebody like me, I can see I'm a pretty physically fit person, and so they go, yeah, it must be a cop, right? So I go to this conference for a couple, 3 years. Actually, I haven't missed it once since 2013. But anyway, I met a guy named Lex Pelger who actually was doing psychedelic stories. And he also, like over the course of a number of years, I ended up developing some trust for him. So he invited me to the after party at Horizons in Bed-Stuy in Brooklyn. So that's Bedford-Stuyvesant for those of you who aren't New Yorkers. It's a formal. It's an area that's actively in the process of gentrification. Used to be a really scary place in New York, and it's a whole lot less scary because all the cool kids live there now. Yeah, so we had this conversation, and he invited me to tell a story at his thing. It was a live thing in Brooklyn. So I went, a couch surf. Curious, like I'm in my mid 50s, you know, couch surfing in Bed-Stuy, telling stories about my experiences with psilocybin. And I didn't want to wait around for other people to invite me to do that again. So I created Story Hour. And there was this like wonderful confluence of events where I met people who were actively involved in building psychedelic community in Boston. We sort of like connected, and I had this sort of like ready-made network of a couple of thousand people that I could reach out to and ask to share stories. So from August of 2017 until the pandemic hit, Story Hour was strictly a live event, and I didn't allow recording for the most part. No pictures. It was like what happens at Story Hour stays in Story Hour kind of thing. And so it became this really beautiful, intimate experience for people. And part of what evolved in the project was that I began to notice the relationship between the stories people tell about their experiences and how those experiences then affect their lives and the people around them. And so as that developed, as that understanding developed and deepened, it changed my own practice with using plant medicine and psychedelics, in the sense that I kind of migrated from my observer mind noting plot points for stories that I was going to tell at Story Hour the following month, to just allowing my observer mind to be with the experience without trying to give it a form. Without saying, okay, this is the turning point. The whole Aristotelian story model. You have beginning, middle, and end. Beginning is inciting incident, the middle is the turning point, and the end, that falling action from there is sort of like all about getting to the happy ending, right? So I stopped doing that in the process of my own experiences. And then I later would tell people that I met at different ceremonies, try that as a way of being with these experiences. So what I began to notice was that when people started telling their stories at Story Hour, they would sort of like reframe how they understood what their experiences were, because the format is unscripted. So people, you know, people go, oh yeah, you know, I'm going to take notes, you know, I'm going to write it all out. I go, no, just show up. Really, rather like we're doing now, right? Like just show up. You know, we'll and that act of like just showing up and being with it requires us, because we're not like thinking ahead of time about what, you know, what the story is. Stories evolve. And the other cool thing that ended up happening was, like, in the beginning, I created themes. So one night would be PTSD night, another would be, you know, sexual trauma night, you know, another one would be like Iboga night, you know, addiction, this and that, and the other thing. And it was, you know, from a producer's point of view, it was a pain in the ass, because then I always had to kind of like get out and find specific people to tell the stories. But from this point of view of just being with the universe and and feeling for flow rather than structure, it has unswervingly happened that every single Story Hour since I moved into that space, the themes developed. Like the universe, like the universe put the people in the room that needed to be in that room, that are around themes that we didn't even know that we shared. And it's extraordinary. And I will say that the universe is sometimes very heavy-handed. One time I live in the suburbs in Boston, and I was driving into town, because I do it with the live event, I do it in town. And I got 2 calls on driving into town from people who canceled it at the 11th hour and 59 minutes. And then at that same time, 2 people called me, and on the trip, and we were talking to go, hey, can you come tell a story tonight? And they were like, hell yeah. And they were the right people to be in the room at that night. And the people who called and canceled would not have, I know, because I've subsequently talked to them, it wouldn't have worked. Mm-hmm. You know, so this is kind of like the genesis and the main body of Ouroboros Story Hour's work. So pandemic hits, now it's like, well, what the hell am I going to do? We can't meet the venue that, well, I mean, every live venue shut their doors and said, stay home. And a couple of friends kind of like cajoled me, because I wasn't really hip with the idea of doing stuff on Zoom. So a couple of my friends cajoled me into doing it. You know, we need Story Hour. You got to do something, right? So that started a whole new adventure with Story Hour. And so that was like March 8th, like, so starting in April of 2019, right? So starting in April, I had to kind of retool the program. We had to, and I thought, well, let's just record these things now and let's turn it into something. So I spent it was April, May, June, July, and August. So that, you know, going into the 3rd anniversary, because the project's anniversary is in August. I kind of like fumbled my way into finding the format. And then once I figured out the format going forward, you know, we've now been doing these things online. And what that's freed me up to do is it's allowed the project to expand beyond the borders of the Boston area. And so you know, and then this is also in large measure thanks to my connections with Thank You Plant Medicine. Story Hour became international last year.
Yeah, that's amazing, right?
It was so crazy. And so, you know, we've been able to create these like these bubbles where, I mean, I had once, I think one of my favorite ones was, I actually had simultaneously someone calling in from South Africa and Hawaii at the same time. Mm. So we've erased time zones, we've erased physical distance, and we've kind of like brought in we've brought in these people to share their experiences in this space. And I know that like Kristen is totally organic, and when I do the live streams, it's totally organic. But then I bundle I bundle each episode into a recorded episode, and I try to limit it to about 2 hours, because otherwise, like, we go on forever and ever and ever. And then I also have now taken people's individual story segments and brought those into sort of like a separate package. And in doing that, I've been able to kind of like reach out the world. We're getting like on the recorded episodes, we're getting well over 20,000 views a month.
Wow.
So how's that for a long question, a long answer to your question?
Oh, good. Yeah. And that's one thing that is, I think, been interesting about the pandemic, and a lot of more things being on Zoom. It allows us to reach more people and to reach out. Like you said, the story hour was kind of just in, one area, and now we're having interviews from the US, but also South Africa, and, just lots of other places. And it's grown a lot. It seems like kind of exponentially started to really grow and reach more people, which is awesome,
Yeah, it's because the thing is, like, I kind of with actually pretty much everything, but most very acutely with plant medicines and psychedelics. I live sort of like, I have one foot in the research world and one foot in the spiritual world. And so a big part of what I'm wanting to do is kind of like research, kind of change the world, but I'm not a scientist. So, I can't, I'm not doing studies, but I'm studying people. And, this now really gives me the opportunity as a creator of whatever the hell it is I create, to affect the world in ways that I could otherwise not have been able to do. And that's funny, like with the pandemic, I mean, there are lots of things I don't like about the last year and a half, or going on 2 years, but it really presented a tremendous opportunity to do this thing, because like the whole world was kind of, I don't know, one way I might say is the world caught up to me, and another way I might say is the world aligned with me. Mm-hmm. In that moment, to allow for this, this thing to happen. And it's just been, the ride's been great. I mean, we've had people from the Middle East, people from Israel, people from South Africa, lots of people from different parts of Europe, all over the US. I'm working on Asia next.
Yeah, everybody coming together with a similar purpose in mind, and to, share experiences and realize, we're all human and we're all in this dance together, and life is hard and life is messy, but life is really beautiful at the same time. And so even though you're reaching in so many different places, there's, that one thing, plant medicine, that's bringing a lot of these people together. And you mentioned, like, before you would set things and now you just kind of don't, but do you notice, like, are there any themes that just kind of naturally seem to occur in all these stories?
Every time themes occur. If you go back and you look at the episode you appeared on, if you kind of track what people talk about, there's always a through line. So I kind of like think of, I'm also a musician. I didn't mention that. So I sing blues and I play, I play blues harmonica. So, and I study jazz. So I really think of what goes on in Story Hour as jazz storytelling. So the way a jazz song is structured, and jazz is a little more complicated than blues, but blues is like fundamentally the same way. But very specifically with jazz, the way that jazz works is that someone comes up with a melody, right? So that we call that the head, and the first soloist, well, actually, like the whole ensemble will play the head, and that will have, that has the melody. And then what people do, what all the individual soloists do, is they play variations on the head. So like the head influences what follows it, but necessarily. And then in the end, the outro, like you restate the head again. And so the way I've structured the way I structure my shows is I tell the first story. So like in a way, I set the frame, and then what follows kind of just comes naturally from it's organically, naturally. It just flows. So yeah, I mean, it just try to think. I so live in the moment with these things that when I'm done with them, like they kind of like just fly out of my head almost. Because I'm thinking about the next one, because that's the jazz approach, right? Like jazz is all about being present with the musicians that are on the stage, having a conversation with them, interacting with the audience. It's kind of like the Grateful Dead did this like to great effect, especially really early in their careers. They used to do. They were the band for the Ken Kesey's Acid Test in the '60s. So everybody's tripping balls, and they would play. So there was no expectation for them to provide a cohesive, like in air quotes, entertaining concert. So they got up and played when they wanted. They sat down when they didn't want to, and they explored everything that they wanted. And their whole thing was about blurring the lines between players and listeners, audience and performers. And that very much influences my approach to Story Hour. So like in the large space, that works super well. And it's been challenging to sort of do that same thing in Zoom space, because we're not all in the same room. I know lots of energy workers, and I know people say that they can do remote Reiki and all that kind of stuff, but there's a proximity. Like I think of it as like a proximity effect. Like when you're in a room with people, the energy is stronger for me, and it's stronger for the people who are in the chairs. And it just, and this may be my limitations as an energy person, but I don't experience it quite the same way. But I'm like working to make that sort of thing, that blurring of blurring of roles, so that we create something together.
Yes, and that's beautiful, because all these people come to you and to volunteer to share their story for an episode. And it's interesting how the universe, like it's almost like behind the scenes is handpicking these people who feel called, because it does seem like the episodes I've watched, or even the episodes I've been a part of, we're not even trying, yet there are themes that are emerging and patterns within our stories. And I'm a part of a sacred fire community in Greensboro here in North Carolina, and I haven't been in a while, but it's similar. Like we usually do check-ins, and the group is different every single time. It's not always the exact same people, but there's always like this theme that seems to emerge. And we just needed to be there together at that night, right, to really relate to each other. And I know for me, like when I hear that other people are going through similar things or have had similar experiences, it brings so much comfort, especially now, because the past few years have been challenging for everybody, collectively, individually, and coming together as community, even if it is on Zoom, has been something that has really helped me a lot. And so when people come to you and they're like, I want to share a story, but maybe they've never shared a story before, or like been in, kind of in the spotlight, so to speak, what advice do you have for them?
All right, so I really, among the really cool things about being unscripted is that it allows for what I like to think of as heart-centered stories. I actually don't, it's not that I would turn away a highly polished performer for Story Hour, but I really do look for people who have stories to tell rather than performances that they want to give. And so, but as we have that conversation about, well, I've never done this before, I'm really afraid, yada yada yada. I draw upon my my English professor stuff. I'll go, I'll tell them about the Aristotelian story model and all that other fun stuff. But I say in the end, just start talking and let the words come out. And the frame that I give everybody is think of an experience or a collection of experiences that changed your perspective on something. And I leave it purposefully vague so that they can kind of like really think, so they can think of like what that means to them. And I like to think that I engender that I this is what I think I am, and I hope that this is how people perceive me. I like to think that I'm warm and that I engender trust in people. You know, it's my dad energy, I think, and so I work hardest at making people feel comfortable about being themselves, and that they're not going to be judged, and that it's okay to open up. And what often happens in the space is people, they're really nervous. They start talking and they might sort of like flounder for first 4 or 5 minutes. But at some point they see that like they get the germ of their story, and bam, it just opens up. And then without fail, they follow that, you know, they'll kind of like fold right into that 3X story model. So why does that happen, right? So we could argue that, you know, that's a learned thing, that, you know, that in Western civilization, that's how we've been telling stories since before Aristotle. Or we could argue that it's a more Jungian thing, like that's the story archetype. And I suspect it's probably that more than, you know, more than just externally imposed on us. There's just like, it's just how we tell stories, and it happens. And I don't ever cut people off. Because the other thing I will do is I say, look, I'm going to block about 20 minutes for you. If you get to 10 minutes and you're done, thank you very much, love you, and we'll move on to the next person. If you're at 20 minutes and you're not like telling the same story 47 times over again, you're being like reasonably productive in moving a narrative. I don't stop, and so sometimes people might go 40 minutes. They might go double. And to know that there's no necessity to fit a very, very specific format to a very specific time frame, I think that it opens things up for people. And let's face it, the more we talk, the more comfortable we get. The more comfortable we get, the easier it is to open up. And as you open up and people aren't throwing rotten vegetables at you, it gets easier. And then by the end, you know, people's hearts are wide open. And that's always like, that's the thing I strive for in the space, is to have wide open hearts. And so what I do, and when I tell my story, believe me, I share things that sometimes I'm surprised I did. I really tell people about that. And so I model for people what I'm inviting them to do. And then we kind of it just goes and it flows.
Yeah, and that's great, because at the nature of telling stories, there is a lot of heart that can be in it, and it can help break walls down when we just show up with zero expectations and just start talking. And it's just like a really beautiful process. And I know for me, like something about just speaking out loud helps me so much process things that happen. And it's even better when you have a group of people who are coming forward with also no expectations and no judgment, to just be able to share and to process and to replay the events in my mind. And stories have been around forever. I mean, before there was like people writing things down, all stories were passed down through generations in various different cultures. So storytelling is not something new, but I think with the busyness and the chaos of our outer world, sometimes we forget how healing it can be to just sit down with a group of people and share what's on your heart.
For sure. And at the end of the day, human minds are story making machines. Everything, you know, when you really think about like what a human being is, our bodies are fundamentally walking, talking sensor arrays. You know, we feel, we taste, we touch, we smell, and then our brains tell stories about that input. So from the moment that I mean, I don't know. From the moment we become conscious, and I don't want to get involved in like when that happens, but from the moment that we become conscious, we're getting input, and we're trying to understand that input in a way, initially in a way that's organized around making sure that we don't get hurt, making sure that we get our food, making sure that we're warm, making sure that someone's holding us, like, so that we can feel safe. And then we kind of like build out from there. And then we create all these mental models that that are interrelated with one another. Now we're going to get into my theory about how the human brain's organized. But it's just we are storytelling machines. And so it's not that we have always told stories. And then there's this, what you were talking about, Kristen, and I kind of like, as soon as you start talking, like, my education brain goes, oh yeah, so like the Odyssey was told in oral tradition. So Homer didn't write it down. That story didn't get written down until much later, much later in our culture. In the Celtic cultures, bards, who, by the way, bards were like rock stars in Celtic culture. So and you had to go to bard college, and it was 12 years. So it was like getting a PhD. And what you had to do was you had to have the ability to, from memory, tell every story in that culture's canon.
Wow.
And then once you could do that, you would get, you would then become the court bard for whatever local king or royal person was around, and so you got paid, like you got taken care of. So like there's like that part of it, but that's like this sort of like very narrow understanding of what stories mean. Mm-hmm. And again, like I really think of this. I really think of us as these story machines. So like when we do psychedelic work or plant medicine work, what we do, this is from sort of like the side. I told you I live on both sides of this, like the science and the spiritual. We create a metaconscious state. So what that means is that's that separation of our observer mind and the experience. And so when we get to that metaconscious state, we're able to look at our memories more dispassionately. So the fMRIs will tell you that that the neural pathways to your prefrontal cortex have been dampened, and that you're creating these new neural pathways to other parts of your brain. So the prefrontal cortex is where it's the judgment part of our brain. It's the executive part of our brain. So when we disengage that and we connect to the stories without that judgment, we're able to sort of like look at what we know, how we know it, and what we think about it, and have the opportunity to ask ourselves, is this true? Is what I think true? So when the first time that I took going back to the what I mentioned before about going to Horizons, I connected with a trip sitter in the Upper West Side of New York, and I drove down from Boston to New York on a snowy day, and I took 5 grams of mushrooms, which for those of you who don't know, that's a lot. Mm-hmm. That some people call that heroic dose. I mean, that's a pretty hefty dose. And things came up in that journey that I didn't even know were kind of like rattling around in my head and affecting me like moment to moment to moment. So I was a bedwetter when I was little, and back in the 60s when people, the Stone Age, right? So my was very heavily judged by my family. My mom would make me go to school with my soiled underwear, and there was like all this like trauma around you smell funny and it's just and all this shame. And so I take these 5 grams of mushrooms. I have this experience. I go through this like whole ritual thing. I poured water down my shirt. But what I ended up understanding was that affected me in ways that I shoved down so deeply, and that it was this really buried but extraordinarily important part of my self story. which revolved around like being weird, being, you know, shame, not really kind of like not being worthy of, not being worthy of people loving me, people liking me, you know, being part of social groups and all that sort of stuff. And that ability to kind of like step back and see that, and for my mind to recalibrate the story and say, you know, yeah, that happened. And, you know, that's just the way I develop, right? Some people don't, some people get tall when they're in the sixth grade. Some people don't grow so they're full height till later on. Like it's all this development stuff. But it's like, what stories do we tell about it? Oh, you're not keeping up, right? You're still peeing in your pants and you're 11 years old. There's something wrong with you. Well, no. This is just how I developed. And that ability to be able to do that, to recalibrate the story, came from being able to be in that metaconscious state, and to look at the experiences and find and really see what was true about it versus what people said was true about it.
So shift in perspective.
Yeah, it's this big perspective shift. So the other thing I was going to say is that, like, I just put this in scientific terms, right? You know, I'm talking about metaconscious and all this. Some people will say that it's the spirits in the mushrooms teaching, and I don't know which is true. I mean, and like even like depending on which camp you live in, like that's another story about our experiences. It's like, yes, it's spiritual experience. Yeah, it's a this, but what's true for both of them is that they're transformative. And it's just, well, how do we explain the transformation?
Like, it makes me want to tell a story right now. I don't even know what story I would tell, but I'm just like, yeah. And right. I mean, growing up, I loved making up stories, and I would always write, you know, when I got a little bit older, I would write stories and poems, and it's just, and I realize every time I stop doing that, things get really stagnant. Like right now, I haven't really written anything in like all year or maybe 2 years. And it's like things start to get kind of stagnant. And I feel like just like dissatisfaction with things. And as soon as I start to, you know, do something like writing again, like that always feels so much better. So like, I'm glad of all people I could choose, you were on my podcast today, just to remind me of the beauty that there is in telling stories, and that, yeah, really everything is a story, and beliefs that we're telling ourselves, and just trying to link things together in our mind and process. So
yeah, because we again, like when you write, you reduce story to top and bottom, left to right, beginning and end. And that's one of the things that as a writer, and I've been exploring these boundaries in my poetry this year really hard. It is the linearity of writing and the multidimensional way in which we actually think. And it's sort of like, how do you? It's like painting, right? Like you can see a painting in my background, right? I mean, that's abstract expressionist, but like there's still a sense of dimensionality in the painting when you look at it. Like you see a foreground, a middle ground, and a background. It's top, bottom, left, right, flat. And what the painter did was use light and shadow to fool our brains into perceiving dimensionality. I mean, if you look at the study of perspective, like you do like multi-point perspective, like you draw lines, and it's sort of like all about like angles and all the stuff to just fool our brains into perceiving it that way. So it's yeah, stories. You can see why I'm totally fascinated with this now, and I spend so much of my time thinking about it.
So when do you do your story hours? You want to share that with people? And we'll, like, you know, as always, in the comments, or not in the comments, in the description, there'll be links to things, but yeah, just give a little bit more information about when you hold it.
All right, so Story Hour is usually the third Thursday of the month, and I do it from 7:30 till about 10 o'clock Eastern time, which gets really funky because, like, you know, on those calls where I have people at the extreme ends of the of time zones, you know, somebody's 4 o'clock in the morning and someone is 4 o'clock in the afternoon, so it gets interesting. But yeah, that's when I do it. So we just wrapped up season 4 in August, so now we're moving into season 5. I'm thinking about changing the night because I'm trying to, like, my recorded episode audiences are huge. My live stream audiences are, I'd like to say, I'm still developing.
Okay.
So we'll you know, I'm gonna do a growth mindset frame on this one, right? I'm not saying it's not where I want it to be, and there's lots of room to develop that larger, because like the whole model is on the Zoom call, it's like studio. The people that come to the live stream are like studio audience, and it's nice when we have. And this happened, if you remember, Kristen, during the Thank You Plant Medicine, was like a lot of people were commenting as the stories were going on, and it really fed the stories, and sort of helped a lot with blurring the lines between, you know, the storytellers and the people who are receiving them. So that's kind of like where we are. So it's Thursday nights, third Thursday of the month, 7:30 to 10. I let people know in various ways. On my list of things to do someday is to get a website, but this year I had to teach myself how to edit video, so there wasn't time for there wasn't time to build a website. But yeah.
All right, awesome. Thank you so much for sharing, and thank you for being a guest today. We're getting close to wrapping up. Is there anything else you want to share?
Well, I want to say, Kristen, thank you so much for being in my life. Both, it was just wonderful when you showed up for the World of Wisdom Thank You Plant Medicine thing that Jonathan and I put together. It was wonderful when you came and told stories. It's nice. It's so much fun that we touch base with each other from time to time. And like I like to feel like part of in my Story Hour community, once we've kind of like shared really intimate things about each other, it's way easier to be close to people. And so, you know, even though we've actually never met in the so-called real world, you know, I consider you a good friend, and I feel close to you, and I'm thankful that you came in, that you're a part of my life right now. I'm also thankful that you invited me to appear in your podcast. As my wrestling coach used to tell me, I was a terrible wrestler, but I talked all the time. He said, you know, if you could wrestle the way you talk, you'd be a state champion. So, I truly appreciate the opportunity to share the work I do with more and more people. It's just I'm very grateful. Thank you.
Yes, thank you. I'm grateful as well. It's a pleasure. And thank you to anyone who has watched on my YouTube channel or listened to the audio. Please subscribe to the channels. Click that bell so you get notified every time there is a new episode. And if you're ever interested in being a guest, just let me know. I hope everyone enjoys the rest of their evening or morning or whatever is next after watching this. And